Hello, this is Robert Rickover at Body Learning, and today my guest is Imogen Ragone, an Alexander Technique teacher and website designer in Wilmington, Delaware. And we're going to talk today about the Alexander Technique Constructive Rest position, and in particular, how it can be a very useful lab, really, for exploring Alexander Technique directing and for exploring another process called up with gravity, which is kind of inspired by the Alexander Technique. Everything that we're going to be talking about is something that you can do on your own without necessarily having any Alexander Technique experience. We aren't going to go into huge detail about why the Alexander process that we're going to talk about works, but we will provide a link where you can learn more about it. So, Imogen, welcome to the show.
Great, glad to be here.
And I guess what we need to do is, first of all, provide a very short description of constructive rest. Do you want to do that?
Sure. So the constructive rest position involves lying down on a firm surface. So typically the floor is what most people have available. I would choose that you want it to be firm, but not so hard that it's uncomfortable. So a carpeted floor, maybe on a rug or a mat if you have a wood floor. And you lie down on your back. We'd like you to put something to support your head, something under your head, maybe a few books, so that your neck is not compressed, so that your neck is, let's say, more lengthened. And so your head is sort of more or less aligned with your spine. Would you say that's what we're looking for, Robert?
Yeah, probably not a huge number of books. That is sort of almost a theological debate in the Alexander world, but at least a little bit of support. Yeah.
What you don't want is for your head to be tipping back.
Yes,
Because
exactly.
that would be compressing the back of the neck,
Right.
the neck, basically, the top of your spine. And and you don't want so much that you feel like you're compressing the front of your neck, your throat. So you're kind of just looking for something so it just...
Somewhere, a nice mean there. And then the other thing is you want something under your knees or some way to elevate your knees relative to your hips.
Yes. So you can just bend your knees and have your feet flat on the floor, or you could rest your legs over some sort of bolster that's wide enough and big enough that the knees are raised up enough so they're higher than the hips. Or you can even rest the whole sort of lower leg, your calves, over a low piece of furniture so that the legs sort of form a right angle shape.
Exactly. And we're not going to go into a lot of detail about this, but we will put a link to a page that has lots and lots of details about constructive rest.
Yeah.
But
the only other thing is maybe your arms. What are you going to do with those? And I think most people kind of bend their elbows and let the hands rest on, somewhere on the abdomen or on the rib cage. Or you can let them kind of lie out wide away from you.
Right.
Lower than the shoulders, though, I'd say.
Probably,
you don't want to be anything else.
And just the constructive rest position by itself, with none of the other things we're going to talk about, is a pretty powerful process for releasing tension. And again, we'll put a link to a site that goes into that in more detail. But what we're going to talk about today is how you can use something called Alexander Technique directions while you're in the constructive rest position, and also how you can use a process called up with gravity, and how you can combine those two. And we're also going to talk about how you can use those two things and do movements of your arms or legs or head probably that discussion will be a second podcast. So I think we should start with Alexander Technique directions, and which are basically instructions that you give yourself that are useful to help you release tension from your body. Um,
Yeah, I would say these are instructions you think to
you
yourself.
think to yourself. You don't have to necessarily say them, but
Yes,
you have the
although you can if you
you
want
can
to.
say them.
Yes.
But they're
Typically,
intense.
it's a thought process, and I guess a key part of that thought process is that the aim is that it is a thought process and not sort of a muscular action.
You're not trying to make something happen
Yeah.
with your muscles, although your muscles may do things, but what you're focusing on is a mental self-direction.
Yes.
And we'll also put a link to a page on a specific type of Alexander direction, which has gained a lot of attention in the last 4 or 5 years, called negative directions. And negative directions are statements, intents, let's say, that you deliver to yourself of the sort, I am not tensing my neck, or I am not tightening my neck, or I am not compressing myself. They're negative statements. A lot of
But
people
very positive in
very
results,
positive
right?
in intent, and we don't really have time in this podcast to go into why they're so useful and how they compare and contrast with other Alexander directions. But again, we'll put a link to a page which goes into that in a great deal more detail. For the moment, we're just going to assume they work. We're going to ask you to experiment with them on the assumption they're useful, and you'll be able to judge for yourself, I think, pretty quickly if they're useful. So one of the things you can do when you're lying down is say things to yourself or think things to yourself, such as, I'm not tensing my neck, I'm not compressing myself. And being in the lying down position or a constructive rest position, it becomes pretty easy to notice the effects of those intents.
Yes, I agree. And it also it's easier to notice, I think, if we're unintentionally putting a little effort into these things. And for that reason, it might be useful experimenting with different types of directions, negative and, I guess, the more traditional, just as a point of experimentation and noticing how the different ways of thinking
You
have
could certainly
different
do that. I mean,
effects.
yeah.
And everyone has different. No one has the same experience, so it's kind of experimenting with what
So if
works best for you.
absolutely. So if you are someone who is a bit familiar with Alexander self-directing, and you're used to directions of the sort, I'm letting my neck be free. That's a pretty classic one. You could experiment with using that, tossing it away, bringing it back, tossing it away, and then maybe shifting over to I'm not tensing my neck, and as the negative version of that, and see if you can notice a difference.
Yeah,
If,
absolutely. And then, you can just try different ways of wording it to yourself because sometimes that can make a difference. We all have different sort of trigger words or experiences that we connect with different words. So,
yeah, and
yeah.
and the key in this kind of self-directing is to, let's say you do a little experiment where you say, well, I'm lying here, and for 5 or 10 seconds I'm going to just say to myself or think to myself, I'm not tensing my neck, and then toss that away, and then maybe think back, well, did anything change when I did that? Did anything change when I tossed it away? It's a very good way of getting some direct feedback on the effectiveness of your self-directing.
Yeah,
The
I
trick,
think so.
however, or the catch in all of that is that sometimes you might self-direct. I'm not tensing myself or not compressing myself, and you might notice something quite interesting going on, and pretty quickly your mind goes to that interesting effect, and then of course then you've lost track of the original direction. So my advice is to keep the experiments very short. 5, 10 seconds, 15 seconds. I wouldn't go much longer than that. And
Mhm.
bear in mind that doing that a couple of times, it comes a point when tossing them away is not all that easy, because you've kind of, you've been doing it, and then suddenly you say no, but there's a little residual still thinking it,
Yeah.
perhaps. So you have to kind of almost sneak up on yourself a little bit, I think, to test out these
Yeah,
directions.
and also be gentle with yourself. We're not kind of forcing these directions on ourselves. We're not overly concentrating on them. It's just letting the kind of thought pass through
Yeah,
your system.
very light.
Yeah.
In fact, I believe that the lighter, the better, as long as they don't become so light that they've kind of disappeared.
Hmm.
But a very soft intent, with ideally with absolutely no expectations, and ideally that if something does happen and it's something nice, you just kind of you make note of it, but you don't get too interested in it, because that
Yeah,
interest takes you away
and
from the intent.
I think that can be almost the hardest thing for most people. One is sort of, we kind of judge ourselves all the time, whether things are doing what we want them to do, or what we think they should do or not. So try and get rid of all of that. I think that's why the idea of experimenting or just playing with these ideas is really useful.
Have fun
And
with
the
it.
other thing is then when you do notice something, not to sort of get sucked into it and start feeling that, or then sort of really just kind of trying to recreate that feeling. Um,
Exactly, exactly.
really just maybe coming back to just thinking that thought again, that that particular moment had helped. Yeah.
Absolutely. And the thing is, it really is a skill that takes a while to learn, to direct yourself in a way that's useful, and then you notice the results and not get sucked into the results. That's a skill. It takes a little while
It
to
does,
build
but
up.
I think being in the constructive rest position is an ideal place for a beginner to start playing with it, because
Absolutely.
it's because you are lying on the floor and you kind of got that contact with the surface that you're aware of. You can kind of immediately tell if you're pulling yourself up, or I think it's easier for people to know what's going on. It certainly is for me.
It's easier because you have feedback from the surface you're lying on. That firm surface gives you feedback. You're in a position that's encouraging release just by itself,
Hmm.
and you're not doing anything else. At least for the first part of these
Hmm.
experiments, you're not moving, so you're aware. It's easier to notice the subtle changes caused by directions when they're not swamped by the relatively large movements of your arms and legs when you're walking, for example. It's just a lot easier to notice stuff. So that's I
Yeah, I think if you really enjoy this kind of thinking and experimenting with your awareness, there's some kind of less obvious negative directions that
mm-hmm,
people might be interested in trying,
mm-hmm, yes, go for it.
such as thinking maybe something along the lines of, I'm not breathing,
That's
which
a
doesn't
nice one.
mean you hold your breath. It's sort of shorthand to your body that I am not breathing in my habitual way. I'm going to just let my body get on with the breathing on its own. Um,
Exactly, and that's a very, very powerful and useful one.
mhm.
Some of my students get right away can sense a difference when
Yeah,
they
I've
say
had
that.
some very
And
immediate
and
relief. Yeah.
you have to be very gentle with yourself on that direction as well, because some people who have had breathing crises in their lives, the
Hmm.
very thought of I'm not breathing triggers all kinds of
Yeah. So know
unpleasant
yourself,
stuff,
know whether this is an appropriate
right?
place for you to go. Yeah.
And be absolutely clear before you even use that direction, for example, that what you're not saying to yourself is I want to stop breathing or hold.
Yes.
You're really just saying I'm not quote breathing, quote
Like, I'm not
breathing
breathing, I'm going to
unquote,
just let the breathing
or
happen.
I'm not breathing the way I usually do. Body, figure out a better way. And inevitably, your body, or your body mind really, figures out a better way, an easier way, a more effective way. And once you experiment with that for a while, most people, the biggest problem for most people is that the shift in their breathing is so noticeable. Typically becomes fuller, often
Hmm.
slows down a little bit, that that is so noticeable that it kind of swamps your awareness. That is, oh my God, that's so interesting. I want to know what's going on. For example, use that negative direction when I'm going to sleep at night in my bed. Now, that's not, of course, the constructive rest position, but it's still a situation where you're not really doing anything.
Hmm.
And I find now it's instant and immediate. And my biggest problem is, how do I avoid getting sucked into being so interested in it that I can continue the
Mm.
direction? Um,
Do you have a solution?
yes, I do have a solution, and I'm thinking a little bit ahead here. I think we had originally thought about doing two podcasts. I think we should do three, probably just one on on negative directions and lying down, but the one, and then do one on the up with gravity material. But here's an interesting solution here, and here's a negative direction when you're lying down that's very curious, which is to say, I'm not lying on the table
Or on the floor
or on the
or
floor.
in my
I'm
bed
not
or
lying
whatever.
down,
Yeah.
or I'm not lying down.
I'm not
Now,
lying down. Yeah,
your
it's sort of a
rational
bizarre
your rational brain,
direction because of course you are lying down.
well, your
Um,
rational brain says that's crazy. I am lying down, but your actual psychophysical mechanism, I guess,
mhm.
says, oh, uh, what he's really saying is, I'm gonna have to do something a little different, or make some rearrangement so that I'm not lying down like I used to, which could have involved a little holding or tensing or whatever. He wants me to be here in a less tight or held way. And
Yeah, that's certainly a really interesting thought to
now,
experiment with when you're in
what
constructive
you
rest.
may notice is when you say I'm not lying down on a firm surface, you may notice a little increase in contact with the surface as some of the
Hmm.
tensions in your body let go. In my case, I didn't notice anything about that for a long time, but what I did notice is that my breathing changed.
Mm.
And that
Which,
to me is a very nice way around the partial way around the breathing issue. That instead of saying I'm not breathing, if I say I'm not lying down or I'm not lying on the bed or whatever, my breathing changes, but my intent isn't about breathing at all. It's about something completely different
mhm.
that I can't often sense all that well. Uh, Say I'm lying on my side in bed, I don't really notice any change in how I'm lying down when I say I'm not lying down, but I
Hmm.
do notice an instant change in my breathing. So those
It's
are the
often the most indirect ways
that's
make
indirect.
the
It's like a double
yeah.
layer of indirectness.
Hmm.
So I would I would sum up from my point of view. I would sum up that constructive rest, very powerful in and of itself,
Hmm.
but also an extremely useful framework within which to explore any kind of Alexander directions.
Yes.
I'm real biased these days towards negative ones, and to explore certain kinds of negative directions that I don't know that you could get any kind of obvious feedback on when you're walking, like say, or moving. Like when I'm walking, if I say I'm not breathing, I don't necessarily notice the effects of that. I might notice that my
That doesn't mean
walking
it's
gets a
not
little,
having an effect,
doesn't
but I
mean it's
think
not
that's one of the
happening.
reasons why the lying down, because that's all we're doing.
Exactly.
We're a lot more aware of the subtleties of what's going on.
Right. And that gives you the confidence that it does bring about a useful change. And in fact, if
Hmm.
you, when you're, say, sitting at your computer or walking or running or whatever, if you say, I'm not breathing, or if you're in your car, you could say, I'm not sitting on the car seat,
Hmm.
those kind of negative directions. Um, they're going to work. It's just that you may not notice it in as obvious a way.
Hmm.
So I think that could probably end our talk on negative directions. Maybe we should end this podcast interview here, unless there's something else you want to add about that,
On
lying down,
directing,
on
no, except
directing
that
and constructive
I
rest.
think experimenting with negative directions and any directions is really, really useful in constructive rest.
And everything you're doing, including the constructive rest itself, is you're not really efforting in any way.
Right,
Constructive rest, you're
absolutely.
just lying there.
Which is
Uh,
a really useful thing to learn about yourself too.
for some people, it's totally crucial.
Hmm.
If you're a real type A person, constructive rest is definitely the thing for you, because it's going to kind of trick you into doing nothing for at least a few minutes.
Yeah.
Anyway, so why don't we'll bring this this, I guess we'll call this part one
Hmm.
of using constructive rest as a lab for self exploration. My guest has been Imogen Ragone, an Alexander Technique teacher and website designer in Wilmington, Delaware. Thanks so much, Imogen.
Thank you.